Japan had never qualified for a World Cup until 1998, and now Japan has qualified for every World Cup since and made consecutive World Cup knockouts, which is a feat only surpassed by France, Brazil, Argentina, and Switzerland. So how did they do it? Because that's not all. Japan has won 4 Asian Cups, which is actually the most in history, and it never even qualified for that tournament until 1988. How do you go from a country that has accomplished essentially nothing in the sport to being capable of being the best Asian team and one of the most consistent World Cup performers? Well, that is quite literally why we're here. Obvious, I'm about to tell you. Because the answer can actually be summed up pretty simply. The J-League. If you're like me, you probably knew that that existed, right? It's Japan's national league. But what you don't know is how recently it was actually formed and what it's meant to the country. Because all of this comes from a conscious decision to found the J-League. And it's not like the sport was just introduced to Japan in like the 1980s, and that's why all of a sudden the Japanese are putting together amazing national teams. It was introduced to Japan in the 1870s. And after it was introduced by the British, of course, what are you even doing in Japan, dude? I mean, the US was there too. It was a party. Whole Meiji Restoration thing. I majored in history and I can't help myself. This isn't the point. Japan actually created 2 different national football soccer competitions right at the end of World War I. In 1917, they founded a national high school tournament, and the Emperor's Cup was founded in 1921, which is essentially the equivalent of the FA Cup. That was over 100 years ago now. Japan even joined FIFA in 1929. Japan has been a part of FIFA longer than almost any other Asian nation. It just still sucked. It's worth mentioning, because the loss in particular happens around this time, that Japan is one of the few, and I'm assuming maybe the only country, whose biggest international win and biggest international loss are to the same country. In 1917, the Philippines beat Japan 15-2, and then in 1967, Japan beat the Philippines 15-0. And it also ties us into the next important date, because Japan accomplished one thing after founding the Emperor's Cup in 1921 up until the J-League, and that was it got the bronze medal at the Olympics. And it happened in 1968. So I'm assuming it's basically the same team that essentially ended the Philippines' existence in 1967. What's crazy, considering there were already 2 international tournaments, there wasn't actually a league in Japan until 1965. And that's just because Detmar Kramer was sent to Japan ahead of the 1964 Olympic Games in Japan and went, hey, guys, we should probably have a national league here if you want to get better at the sport. So Mr. Kramer was right. They founded the Japan Soccer League in 1965 with 8 clubs and steadily expanded until it reached 2 divisions. And then this is the initial wave that produced the thumping of the Philippines and an Olympic bronze medal in 1968. But that wave hit the shore and then receded, because after that, Japan failed to even make any Olympic Games up until the founding of the J-League. So it was 1 bronze medal and then nothing. But in the 80s, the Japanese were named as the host for the 1992 Asian Cup, which is a tournament that had been going on since 1956, and Japan had only qualified for 1 time in 1988, making it to the group stage. But as the 1992 host and long just reveling in the fact that Japan's national team sucked, they came up with a plan. The owners of the semi-professional Japan Soccer League, that's right, this whole senior league in Japan was semi-professional and corporate-controlled clubs with no affiliation to anybody, to any area, right? They were owned by companies. For example, the most successful club out of these was Nissan FC, who won the Asian Champions League, the Asian Cup, before the league even went professional, and they were called Nissan FC. And in 1991, they agreed to disband this semi-professional corporate-controlled league and create a fully professional J-League that was more grounded in local areas. Not only was the league system becoming more professional, but it was attempting to ingrain itself in Japanese culture and create the same sort of footballing soccer culture that exists in a lot of other places around the world, with locally tied clubs that are not only better for general interest, but also better for developing players. This wasn't necessarily the creation of new clubs, this was the grounding of a lot of those corporate clubs into their local areas and affiliating them with the area that they came from. For example, Nissan FC was reborn as Yokohama Marinos. I'm a big Marinos guy myself. Always thought that they had a beautiful style to their game. And the impact was immediate. Before the J-League even finally kicked a ball in its inaugural season in 1993, Japan, which again had been to one Asian Cup ever and got knocked out in the group stage, won its hosted Asian Cup in 1992. Won the whole thing. The Asian Cup had been going on since 1956, and all you had to do was whisper about players becoming professional and start the process that wasn't even completed yet of professionalization, and Japan won the Asian Cup. I don't think you're ever going to see a better return on investment than Japan's transition to the J-League produced. This created a ton of momentum, and Japan was super excited to go to its first World Cup. The problem was, on the final match of qualification, Japan drew against Iraq, a moment that is remembered as the agony of Doha. But fortunately for Japan, it was their last agony outside of a World Cup. 5 years on from the beginning of their fully professional league, grounded in local clubs, a full team of J-Leaguers qualified for the World Cup, and even though they got knocked out in the group stage, they lost all 3 matches by just 1 goal apiece. And 2 of their opponents were Argentina and Croatia, so those are pretty darn good results. The third was the Reggae Boys of Jamaica, which it was their first World Cup. And by 1998, the J-League 5 years on had gone from 10 to 18 teams in the top flight. This fluctuated a bit with the creation of the J2, which is the second league where a couple of teams had to drop down, but it returned to 18 teams in 2005, and the J2 is now rounded out at 22 clubs as of 2012. The J3 is just finished expanding to 20 clubs, building a 3-team pyramid that makes up clubs representing 41 of the 47 prefectures in Japan. Now that is a wide net to collect and produce talent. And the success internationally was not going unnoticed. After their first World Cup, Japan ran off 2 consecutive Asian Cup championships, winning the Asian Cup in Lebanon and the Asian Cup in China in 2004. And in between those, Japan hosted the World Cup, co-hosted it with South Korea, and made it to the knockout stages for the first time before losing to Turkey, who made it all the way to the semifinal. That team, notably, had 4 players playing in Europe on it. And that was the beginning of this final process of the Europeanization of the Japanese national team that was allowed by the J-League. You see, the J-League maintained a core of players on the national team through the 2010 World Cup, where Japan made it to the round of 16 again, but increasing globalization in sport and the increasing visibility of the talent Japan was producing with this new, viable, locally based league, 6 of those 19 J-League players that played at the 2010 World Cup moved to European clubs in the same summer. That meant by the Asian Cup the following January, 9 players on the Japanese team were based in Europe, and Japan won its 4th Asian Cup title after coming in 4th place 4 years previous. That means at the Asian Cup the following January, 9 players in the Japanese team were based in Europe, and Japan won its 4th Asian Cup, which I mentioned earlier is a freaking record. And they weren't even trying the first half of the Asian Cup's existence. The number continued to rise, with 12 players at the 2014 World Cup being based in Europe, and by the 2018 World Cup, it was 15 outside of Japan, with Keisuke Honda, who was maybe still the best player on that team, being based in Mexico, the other 14 in Europe. At the most recent World Cup, 19 of the 26 players not based in Japan. Now, debate has raged in Japan, as it does in places like the United States as well, about whether it's a good idea to send your best players to Europe into major leagues in order to get experience. But as the results show, that is simply the best way to do it. And Japan has shown that, because Japan has made consecutive knockout stages with its 2 teams that have the largest amount of European club representation. But without the J-League, none of this is possible. Without the J-League, there isn't a pipeline to get players onto the international stage and even scouted and found to be able to go play at these major European clubs. They don't have the ability to train up to the level to go play at these European clubs. And the other effect of the J-League is the localization and the increased intensity of passion for the game. I mean, J-League chairman Yoshikazu Nonomura he says, football culture has taken root in Japan. The Japan Association for Financial Planners does a poll of elementary school boys on what they want to be when they grow up, and baseball player was the top preference of career aspirations, as one must, in their annual survey, with soccer player or coach being second in 2008. By 2013, soccer player or coach had surpassed involvement in baseball, and with the exception of 1 year in 2018, it has stayed surpassed. It stayed above. It has continued to surpass baseball. And with the rise of bigger and bigger Japanese stars in Europe, the idolization of those stars in Japan, and the enthusiasm to want to be football players, soccer players when they grow up, is just growing. And all of that comes from the J-League. And the final stage of this Europeanization of the national team is occurring right now. Players that only play for a year in the J-League are capable of moving to Europe and making a massive, near immediate impact. Just look at Mitoma. Mitoma had just signed on to the first team at Kawasaki Frontale right as the COVID-19 pandemic was happening. But after putting out an excellent performance as a rookie in the league, in 2021, he was signed by Brighton, loaned out for a year, and now he's back in the Premier League doing absolute bits. All of that development occurring in the J-League, in a nation where 30 years ago, there wasn't even a fully professional league, and the best team was named Nissan. It's an amazing turnaround, and one that from my generation does not get enough credit, summed up by this quote: "When the league began, I think a lot of people thought of it as just flashy entertainment. Now 30 years have passed, and I think we are getting closer to the real J-League that we were aiming for." But this story is evidence of what can happen if you are willing to throw away a league system you don't think is best for developing the talent in your country and build one that you think is. My goodness, it's working. If you enjoyed the research and reading that went into this video, please do click the subscribe button, and that is all you have to do. You can relax and continue your binge, because I have a video about a wonder kid that just completely vanished after Juventus spent millions and millions of pounds on him. Like, he's just, we can't even figure out where he is right now. It's a pretty wild story, so. Gotcha.